Hi, this is Paul. This is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the status of my Sunday sermon. I might do some editing, and this might just be the Sunday sermon that appears on the church channel this Sunday. I'll decide after I make it and see what happens Sunday morning, and you'll see what comes out on the channel. I also have a longer version of this that I'm going to be releasing on Monday with a lot more content in it that deals with the usual stuff that I do, a lot more elaboration, more slides, etc., etc. So if you see the rough draft, and then if on Monday it seems to look the same as the rough draft, it isn't. So just be warned. Who sinned to cause this virus? Was it the Chinese? Was it the American government? Was it people who don't wash their hands thoroughly or break quarantine or something like that? Who sinned to cause this? Now, predictably and pretty much immediately, when something like this comes out, there will be questions about the judgment of God. Is the coronavirus a judgment from God? The pastor of the First Baptist Church, I think of Dallas or Houston or someplace in Texas, and this person was quite a visible supporter of Donald Trump, and so news agencies hit him pretty hard. Why Trump-friendly Christian leaders are feeling totally fine about the coronavirus. I really don't think any Christian leaders are feeling totally fine about this coronavirus, or just about anybody else in particular. What struck me was that the message that he gave was not all that different from a message that Tim Keller gave. Tim Keller is the author of Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, a book I very much endorse. And the answers that Christian pastor gave are not terribly different from the answers that Christian pastors have been giving for centuries about questions like these. In fact, right at the beginning, who sinned? This comes from this week's lectionary text. As he went along, he saw a blind man from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," says Jesus. Does that mean that this man and his parents were without sin? No, that's not what Jesus is saying. What is Jesus saying? This happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Do you feel better about that answer? It's sort of like the Jews being God's chosen people and Israel. And if you look at everything they suffered, people often joke, well, go choose somebody else. Make somebody else your illustration. How is being born blind better because you wind up being a sermon illustration of Jesus? I'd like my sight, thank you very much. Now, to make this even more uncomfortable, there's a healing story previously in the Gospel of John where Jesus comes up to a man after he's healed him. If you're curious about this story, I did 4 lessons in it before coronavirus shut down the church, or at least meetings at the church. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning or something else might happen to you." So where is Jesus on this question? In fact, this question doesn't come from nothing. If you look it up in any Bible dictionary, you'll notice that plague or pestilence come from God. There's no question that in Hebrew or the New Testament mind that plagues are part of the judgment God sends to individuals, families, and nations. God himself threatened to send plagues to the Israelites in proportion to their sins and takes full responsibility for the Egyptian plagues. The Old Testament plagues demonstrates God's control over the processes of nature, just as do Christ's miracles in the New Testament. And that is consistent throughout the Bible, which is part of the reason why these questions keep coming up. Now, today, a lot of people duck them, not because of issues in the Bible, but because of what we would call the subtraction story, which is laid out by Yuval Harari in his book. He basically says that in the past, we used to think that these things came from divine agents and spirits and beings and things. Now we know that they just come from germs, and so we've pretty much put them out, except of course war, which comes from us. But even so, how many of these things don't have human fingerprints all over them? Part of this big change came with the philosophical movement called deism, which happened in the West. And you see a change in the relationship between God and his creation. Deism is said to be the belief in the existence of a supreme being, specifically of a creator who does not intervene in the universe. But even just in the way they set up that sentence, you find, which is a distinction between creature and creator in Christianity, but how in fact are they connected? And this little diagram, traditionally in the Bible, God is both transcendent, he transcends the created order, and he's immanent, he's within the created order. And my favorite example of this is Isaiah 6, where the angels cry of God, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." He's transcendent. The whole earth is full of his glory. He's immanent. God is very much involved. In other words, God doesn't need to intervene in creation. He's already there. In deism, that move to God as transcendent, he's still the source of the creation, but he's a little bit further away from it, to then secularism, where human beings are a buffered self, where God and creation, well, God for many people is the mental projection of creation up into the order. Now, what happens as deism gives birth to enlightenment and science is that we all come to say, well, we know that plagues and pestilence are not caused by God. They're from germs and viruses. As if, let's see, right away, God and germs and viruses live on totally different planes. We can treat them, we can prevent them, we can contain them. And now with COVID-19, we're wondering whether, in fact, we can. Now, then we say, well, these are random events. But if you ever asked yourself, what do you mean by random? See, random is in one way a way of saying these are things that I can't predict or control. But there's also a subtle religious assertion beneath it saying no one knows them or controls them. There's no purpose behind them. Now, this is what, when we get into this question of what do we mean by random or chance, we make an assertion. There's no purpose behind it, when the truth is that we're unable often to tell when there is purpose behind something and when there isn't. If a bomb goes off, we might say, well, the particular direction of the shrapnel of that bomb have no purpose behind them. They fall randomly or chaotically, but really they don't. We just don't know how and when and exactly where they go. Random or chance are words to describe the limits of our knowledge or our capacity to predict outcomes. See, in a secularized impersonal universe, there's no reason behind anything that has happened. There's no intentionality. There's no purpose. It is an event in physics without cause, purpose, or intentionality. And the whole world is as such. But if you read older documents like the Heidelberg Catechism, you very quickly learn that, well, they don't talk that way. Just listen to the language here. What do we understand by the providence of God? The almighty and ever-present power of God, by which God upholds as with his hand heaven and earth and all creatures, and so rules them, leaf and blade, rain and drought, fruitful and lean years, food and drink, health and sickness, prosperity and poverty. All things, in fact, come to us not by chance, but from his fatherly hand. In fact, you have language that says if God were to look away, everything would just fall out of existence. We're that dependent on God. And this is very different from a secularized realm where God they're sort of independent from each other. But already we see we can't really often distinguish purpose, even in people or maybe even in ourselves. And we admonish people, don't presume motivation. Now, in the ancient realm, they had similar things like this in that the gods, Zeus and Hermes and Apollo, these things emanated from other more basic gods who emanated from what one scholar calls a meta-divine realm, out of which gods sort of emerged, just like in modern cosmology, elements just sort of emerge through processes that we may or may not be aware of. But in this ancient world, the gods were part of the system. They're bound by its rules. They're bound by the fates. Their knowledge and powers are limited. And that's why we see these gods coming out and they're chaotic and and sometimes good and sometimes bad, and doing this and doing that. And people are just here in this realm, and we're all trying to use the power that we have to get our own way. In the Hebrew story, it's a very, very different thing. God stands as the alternative to the meta-divine realm, not subjects to the rules of an impersonal arena. He creates the world out of his own desire for his own purposes towards his own ends. Now, what has happened is that God as a word is sort of used as a useful shorthand. And we see that, I noticed that when I watched Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris debating with each other, that for Jordan Peterson, this is where I got my idea of God number one and God number two. Even though they're the same God in Christianity, God as general revelation immanent, and God as agent, as an actor. And in that way, as Paul says in the book of Acts, in him we live and move and have our being, the Apostle Paul is quoting a Stoic poet and saying, it's in God that we live. Well, what does that mean? Is God pantheistic? No, God is not limited, but God, in fact, creates this. And so in that sense, in him we live and move and have our being. God is sort of the arena in which the story unfolds. He's the ground of all being. He's immanent. The whole earth is full of his glory. That's God number one. But God is also beyond the created order, not exhausted by the created order. He's holy, holy, holy. He's apart from the created order. He's an agent. He's both the arena and the agent. Now, an imperfect analogy that I used with a group of people who were asking me about Calvinism and predestination and all of this stuff was I sort of explained in a way a game designer, how a game designer creates a world or an author creates a book. The players have consequential agency within the book, but it's all dependent on the agency of the creator of the realm who is immanent within it. The players have contingent freedom, but the greater freedom is of the maker itself. I've once asked the question, could Frodo in The Lord of the Rings find Tolkien? Well, in one sense, you can't find Tolkien within the story of The Lord of the Rings because J.R.R. Tolkien doesn't appear there, but you can't see that J.R.R. Tolkien isn't everywhere around and even within Frodo in ways that Frodo can't know. And now all of these analogies are imperfect, but it gives us a sense that unlike deism, that God is far away from the universe, well, God is everywhere. Holy, holy, holy. The whole earth is full of his glory. It's both and. And so when it comes into the questions of God and a pandemic like this, it's not easy to pull these questions apart. Our agency is not in competition with God's. And when, in a sense, we go against God and his agency, that is what we call sin. Now, in this story, again, it begins. As he went along, he saw a man born blind from birth. The disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus said, neither this man nor his parents sinned. Again, he's not saying his parents were without sin. He's saying you can't easily draw the cause and effects always between this thing happening and here's the sin that caused it. Sometimes you can. You can't always. Most of the time, we can't. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Oh, in other words, all of this belongs to God, and God is using it to achieve some purpose? That's what Jesus is saying. Now, we don't like to feel that way because we like to imagine, like Neo, we're masters of our own destiny. Well, how is Frodo separate from Tolkien? Can Frodo imagine himself to be separate from Tolkien? He can imagine himself, he can act like he is, but he's actually created by Tolkien. But again, questions of agency, these things get really, really complicated. And then Jesus says this, as long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. What is Jesus saying? That we see the world through him. After this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it in the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. Now, again, there's no conflict between the kinds of miracles that Jesus, let's say, did in John chapter 4, when a royal official came to Jesus worried about his son who was about to die, and Jesus said, "Go home, your son's fine." Jesus healed the son just like that. Didn't have to mix blood and mix mud or put anything on his eyes or anything. Because just as C.S. Lewis mentioned, when Jesus makes water to wine in John chapter 2, God makes water to wine every day. Jesus just did it shortly. God can do such things like this. But God, every time water becomes wine in a vineyard here all over Northern California, God is making it such. We talk like that. We should talk like that because it's all been built by him. So the man went, washed, came home seeing. But Jesus sets these things up so that he can get the impact of the story. And again, go back and watch the Sunday school lessons on John chapter 5, where Jesus is provoking conflict with the religious leaders in order to teach the people something. His neighbors and those who had seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "The man that they called Jesus made some mud and put them on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and I washed and I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked. "I don't know." So then what do then? They take him to the religious authorities. They brought him to the Pharisees, the man who had been born blind. Now the day in which Jesus had made the mud and turned the man's eyes and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Oh, Jesus was provoking them. And again, go back and watch those Sunday school lessons. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Now, some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." Oh. So here's where we have the data and the narrative. Here's where the Pharisees are trying to make sense of the world. And there's dissonance. They're not putting it together because the Pharisees know their Old Testament. Sin is a rebellion against God. How can this work? But they're also imagine that, well, the mind of God can be easily known by outcomes. And so now the Pharisees are divided on this situation. Now, this is a very old subject. And in fact, it's the subject exactly of the book of Job. Because in the book of Job, calamities befall Job, and all of Job's friends say, "Surely you must have sinned to cause this." And Job says, "No, that's not how it works." And which is exactly what Jesus says in John. That's not how it works. But Jesus also warns the other guy, stop sinning, or something worse might happen to you than being a cripple and being 38 years by a pool and having no friend good enough to put you in the pool. Well, what does that mean? Is sin always connected? Is a particular instance of sin or a particular instance of calamity always connected in a way we can see it? No. Is it never connected? No. Do we like that answer? No. We want to know. Why? Because we want to control. Why do we want to control? Because we think we need what we know. We think we need what we want and what we know, and we think we know how the world should go. And so we draw very simple relationships. And we imagine we can read God's mind by seeing what happens. And that's somehow this easy math that we can do and put it on others. So they turned again to the blind man. What do you have to say about him? Well, it was he who opened your eyes. And the man says, he's a prophet. That's kind of a standard answer. Elijah, Elisha, this guy has divine power, so he must be in alignment with God, so he must be a prophet, and that's how it happened. They still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you said was born blind? How is it that he can see?" See, they're looking for the data, so they call in the parents. And the parents, they're having a fierce culture war, and the parents don't want to get on Jesus' side or the other side, and they totally duck the whole thing. "We know he's our son," the parents answered, "and we know he was born blind. But how can he see now? Or who opened his eyes? We don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid. They were afraid he was going to get put out of the synagogue. Well, you can see how cultures wars go. That's exactly what happens today. It's happening right now. This guy's on this side, this guy's on that side. Hopefully, in a pandemic, which we're seeing some of, people say, "Hey, let's bury the hatchet on the culture war," but we never completely resist it. Politics is now, religion is always. A second time they summoned the man who had been born blind. "Give glory to God by telling the truth." The guy just probably sighs. "We know this man is a sinner," they replied. He replied, "Whether or not he's a sinner, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, and now I see." Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I've already told you and everybody else how many times, and you didn't listen. Why don't you listen?" Now we get into the deeper rhythms of blindness and seeing that travel through the Gospel of John. All of these themes. And again, I've been doing the Gospel of John in my Sunday school class. Listen to those stories about the Gospel of John. There are all these layers in these stories. The religious leaders don't want to see the truth. They are walking in darkness. They are blind. And the man is basically saying, "Open your eyes." And then he gets sarcastic with them. "Why? Do you want to hear it again? Do you want to be his disciples too?" That didn't go over well. Then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." Contrast that with John 3, where Nicodemus says, "We know that you come from God." So right there, we can see that they're quite divided over Jesus because they don't know what to believe. The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opens my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners." That's what your Sunday school lessons say. He listens to godly people who do his will. They're not living within a meta-divine realm. They're living within a Jewish context. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. This is an outstanding miracle. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Then Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and he found him. And Jesus, not just being, "Oh, I'm so sorry this happened to you," all the kinds of things we would say to be nice, Jesus puts yet another question to him. Jesus isn't done working in his life. This man's whole life, his sufferings, everything that he had dealt with, are there to illuminate the glory of God. And yes, he suffered. And yes, it was cruel. Was God at work in it? Jesus says yes. Not in the simplistic way we like to draw, but God says yes, even in the difficult things. Jesus says God was at work. And he says, "Do you believe the Son of Man?" Now he triggers Daniel 7. Where the Son of Man is this figure who is given by the Ancient of Days an eternal kingdom and a dominion that will last forever. "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I might believe in him." Jesus said, "You have seen him. Your eyes were closed. Now they can see." In fact, he is the one speaking to you. You can see him and you can hear him. How will you respond? Then the man said, "Lord, I believe. I trust." And he worshiped Jesus. That's something that Jews wouldn't do. Worship a man. Imagine that the world isn't, he took his Jewish Sunday school, the world isn't an impersonal place in which gods sort of emerge and play with things. The world is made by God. In him we live and move and have our being. You don't worship a man. God is the arena. Can he also be written into the story? Can Tolkien show up in The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings? Can the game designer become part of the game? Now, a lot of people will say this pandemic is something that God should have avoided. Well, that's awfully hard to say. Because in a sense, what we do is we sort of want God to be in the system, like Zeus. And then when we say, well, this pandemic, God has no part in the making of this pandemic, well, then suddenly, well, I guess the pandemic happened because God wasn't strong enough or the fates decreed it. Then we're very much back in a pagan realm. Now, think carefully about your choices, because a lot of people, and I understand why, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute, say, well, it hurts to feel that God says he loves me, but then allows these things to happen. Yeah. God allowed things to happen to Jesus. Jesus is the illustration of the book of Job. The book of Job is the illustration of Jesus. What God is saying is, I will take on pain for you. Is your impersonal meta-divine realm, ancient or modern, actually better? It makes you feel better because it says, I don't imagine that God would treat me personally or allow me to suffer personally. What kind of a friend would allow that? Now that's a deep and difficult question. In fact, this individual, Eric Weinstein, who's a very smart mathematician, articulated this in a way that I'd been struggling to try and put it into words. It's better if there is no God, because if there is a God, you don't have to worry about what's on his mind. What this reveals is that what's really deep at heart are our trust issues. But Jesus is no coward with this, and he's not afraid of nuance, nor does he have patience for the easy math answer. Who sinned, this man or his parents? No. That the works of God might be displayed in him. This man has been, from the moment he was born, property of God. Oh, that violates our sense of independence, and that violates our sense of dignity. And again, as Jesus said in John 5, stop sinning or something else might happen to you. Sin is not disconnected with our calamity. God is not disconnected from our calamities. But Jesus said God uses these sufferings. And again, what we see are our trust issues. So after the March 15 sermon, this YouTube commenter who started over on my personal channel has come over to the church channel, said this: I always feel like Pastor VanderKlay has to match the tone of a chronically ill person. And I do that on purpose, because I know people suffer. And so to preach insensitively about people suffering is not wise. And you might say, well, Pastor, by definition, you saying God is involved is insensitive. Well, we don't know how God is involved in the details, the easy math layer. But we know that God is involved in the big layer. So how do we talk about it? And then this person asked a much harder question, much more personal question. As a personal question to the pastor, what is it that God is doing that you're not okay with? Well, I'm not okay with the virus. I wasn't okay with my sister's death. I'm not okay with my father's death. I'm not okay with the poverty that I see all around me. I'm not okay with racism that I see has permeated American life. I'm not okay with how many things in this world. You know what I am okay with and should be less okay with? My own sin. Because when I look at my life, I realize, how much stuff don't I bring on myself? I'm very quick to blame God or blame someone else, when very often the source of my troubles are me. Can I blame God for that? You can see how tricky this gets, right? What am I not okay with? A lot. Which is why I'm religious. Which is why I go to church. Which is why I go to church. I can't go to church now. Which is why religion, which is why I bind myself to people and practices and books and traditions, because at heart, what's the problem? What provokes? Well, there's a lot of things that should provoke fear in me. And right now, there are a lot of things to be afraid of. But what I need to learn is trust, because it's not true that Christians don't get the virus, and it's not true that Christians won't die of the virus. Again, go back to the sermon about the snakes. They complained about food and water, and God sent snakes. And then they complained about the snakes and said, take the snakes away. And God said, no, I'm not taking the snakes away. At least make them not bite. No, the snakes still bite. At least make it not be sick. No, the people get sick. Said, put the bronze serpent up on the pole and you will not perish. Yeah, there's lots I'm not okay with, but that's just me. And I'm not the judge of the universe. And what I'd really love to be is to be the judge and center of the universe, but I'm not. And I can't account or answer for what all God does, but what I have to learn to do is trust. And you might say, I'd prefer the meta-divine realm where it's not personal. Okay, but then there is also no purpose or plan for your goodness beyond your suffering. Then your suffering is random and there is no answer to it. Do you find that to be a better solution? I don't. So I'm religious and I'm bound to this. And this great question and answer, Lord's Day 1 of the Heidelberg Catechism, is something I memorized and something I say often, and something I hold on to in times like this. What is your only comfort in life and in death? That the CDC is going to fix this? That the government is going to have a great plan? I hope they do. I hope they do. I hope they do. But I don't have a tremendous amount of confidence in them. People have dropped the ball all along the way here. The Chinese government was in denial. The U.S. government was too slow. Maybe, I don't know. I can't know. Random? I don't know. I'm one little person. What is my only comfort in life and in death? That I am not my own. And I think, I want to be my own. I want to be independent. If he turns his head, the universe flees. I'm not my own. I trust the storyteller. I trust the game designer. Well, how can you in this world of pain? It doesn't come naturally. I have to learn and lean into it. What is your only comfort in death? That I am not my own, but belong body and soul, in life and in death, to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. Why? Because he fully paid for all my sins with his suffering. He has skin in the game. It's not random. It's not chanceless. My master has skin in the game. The arena became an agent and one of us. And my own sins, he's fully paid for all my sins with his precious blood and has set me free from the tyranny of the devil. He also watches over me in such a way that not a hair can fall from my head without the will of my Father in heaven. In fact, all things must work together for my salvation because I belong to him. And again, there are days that I don't feel like that. There are days that maybe I wish the universe was random so I could curse God and die, as Job's wife advised to him. Or I feel like I can't believe that God would have a hand in this and therefore not also be in control. Because I belong to him, Christ by his Holy Spirit assures me of eternal life and makes me wholeheartedly willing and ready from now on to live for him. And that's aspirational. I wish I was more wholeheartedly willing and ready to live for him, but I'm not. And so I say this to myself again and again, and I remember it and I pray it, and I say, what is my only comfort? That I am not my own, body and soul. If this virus takes my body, I will be with him. If this virus takes my life, I will be with him. I can trust him. Come what may. Ever watch Moulin Rouge? Come what may. How do you understand the providence of God? The almighty and ever-present power of God, by which God upholds with his hand heaven and earth and all creatures, and so rules them, leaf and blade, rain and drought, fruitful and lean years, food and drink, health and sickness. I could rap like Freddie. Prosperity and poverty. All things, in fact, come to us not by chance. I can only see so far, but from his fatherly hand. How does this knowledge of God's creation and providence help us? We can be patient when things go against us thankful when things go well. And for the future, we can have good confidence in our faithful God and Father, that nothing in creation will separate us from his love. For all creatures are so completely in God's hands that without his will, they can neither move nor be moved. This is God's word for us. Who sinned? Well, sin is ubiquitous. Can we trust in the midst of this sin with imperfect creatures when things feel out of control? Yes, because we are not our own, and we know the Master, and we live in him.